Hey, glad you're back. Hope you had a great weekend. And our mini message today is in Genesis 38. And it's an even kind of odder passage that we're going to look at today. Remember, Judah's son, Er, has been killed. God took his life because of the evil and the wickedness that he had been committing. Whatever that was, we don't know for certain. We can draw some conclusions, but at the end of the day, it's trying to read between the lines. And I don't mind doing that, but I'm always going to tell you when I am. So we don't know exactly why that's happened, but the next part of this in verse 8 picks up and deals with something that was common in this culture, something the culture did. Look at verse 8. It said, "Then Judah said to Er's brother Onan, 'Go and marry Tamar, as our law requires of the brother of a man who has died. You must produce an heir for your brother.' But Onan was not willing to have a child who would not be his own heir. So whenever he had intercourse with his brother's wife, he spilled the semen on the ground. This prevented her from having a child who would belong to his brother. But the Lord considered it evil for Onan to deny a child to his dead brother. So the Lord took Onan's life too." Wow, here we are. Okay, let's try to kind of deal with this and try to pull this apart a little bit and look at some context and some of the culture. So according to the custom, if a man died before providing a son to his wife, it was the duty of one of his brothers to then marry her and give her a son. And that son would not be considered his heir. It will be considered the deceased brother's heir, so that his family line would continue. This also continues from the thought process of a widow. A widow whose husband died and that didn't have a son or sons to provide for them could find themselves destitute. Women in this time were not treated as equals. They didn't have the freedoms. They didn't have the standing in culture that they have today, that they should have had in that time. But it was the world they were living in. We have to be honest about that. And so a woman could find herself in deep trouble, especially a young widow. That she could find herself, if she couldn't remarry, if she couldn't find somebody to be willing to do that, then she could find herself in a really big deal. And it was incredibly important for the dead brother's name to be carried on. And that family line was so vital and so important. And so Judah is following this custom. And so he tells his next son, his second oldest son, Onan, to marry her and to have a child with her. And this first son would not be considered his heir. Any other sons produced would be considered his heir, but the first would be considered his brother's heir. He didn't want to do this. See, what was happening here is he refused to take the responsibility to father the descendants for his dead brother. He didn't want to do it. He apparently was okay with using Tamar for sexual gratification, but he didn't want to give her this son. And it kind of leads us down the road when you read the rest of the story, and as we'll put this into context over the next several days, it leads you to think that Judah doesn't really know what's happening here, that nobody told him. Tamar didn't feel that she could say anything about this. Onan certainly wasn't going to say anything about this, so he didn't understand why no child was being produced, why there was no heir happening here. And so what happens is his motivation was evil, Onan's was. He sinned against his father, he sinned against Tamar, and now he sinned against his dead brother. He put his own personal interest above his brother and above his family. And in that sense, God saw that as serious enough that from Scripture, he ended this young man's life as well. And so it's another dark piece of Scripture. And I wish I could make it make sense more probably in our culture. But that's where we have to pull ourselves out and understand this is a much different Near East culture with much different customs in what they were doing than what we would see today. And so it seems incredibly foreign to us. But we have to look at it through the lens of what that culture was doing, and that God wanted this brother apparently to have an heir to continue that family line. And when it didn't happen, he took his life as well. As I said, it's a dark part of Scripture, but it's showing us the reality of who these people were. God shows us a man with all of his flaws. And we'll continue talking about that tomorrow.